It's OPB Politics Now for Friday, October 6th. During the 2023 legislative session, Democrats were not interested in making system-wide changes to the state's drug decriminalization experiment. But now that seems to have changed. Maybe it's the streets lined with open drug use, or maybe it's the dramatic and devastating increases in overdoses, or perhaps it's just because polling has made it clear that Oregonians are fed up. Whatever the reason, top Democrats say all options are on the table as the legislature prepares to meet next year. We'll dig into the politics behind the sudden change of heart and what it means for the future of the state's drug policies. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB politics reporter Lauren Dake.
And I'm OPB politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
Dirk, during the 2023 legislative session, there were a lot of Republicans who were urging Democrats to rethink Measure 110. And Republicans were shut down pretty firmly. So what has changed?
You know, that is a question I have been interested in. And actually, I've put to some Democrats because you are right, Lauren. When the 2023 session convened earlier this year, majority Democrats seemed to have a pretty set approach. You know, Republicans, as you mentioned, were saying throughout the session that the state needed to repeal at least a piece of 2020's Measure 110, and that would be the piece of the law that decriminalized possession of small amounts of drugs. Republicans have been adamant that Measure 110 is a leading reason for some of the major challenges Oregon is now facing with drugs. I think that is very much up for debate, the causality there, but that is certainly their position. But Democrats sort of adopted the same position many of them had taken in last year's elections, which is that it's too early to call 110 a failure and sort of back off. And we just needed to sort of get it up and running properly to see what impact it truly might have. So to that end, Democrats pushed a bill that sort of streamlined how money goes out to treatment services. They did push another bill closing a loophole that had made it impossible to charge misdemeanor possession for fentanyl. But that was as far as they would go. And then the session ended, and almost immediately we heard Democrats saying, you know, urgent action is needed. We got to fix this stuff. And I think that's for a lot of the reasons you mentioned up top, Lauren. Open air drug markets in Portland and other places, a dramatic rise in overdoses due to fentanyl, even instances like we saw last week where 8 people overdosed in the same park at the same time. You know, these really sort of harrowing tales. And a very anxious public that polls show is not happy with how this is going.
So now we have Democrats, and not just any Democrats, you know, leading Democrats, including Governor Tina Kotek, who seem willing to revisit this topic.
Yeah, and let's note, it's not just Measure 110. I mean, this is really about the addiction crisis more generally. Last week, we learned the legislature has convened a new committee with a specific mandate to come up with solutions to the drug crisis the state's facing. The chairs of that committee are Senate Majority Leader Kate Lieber and Representative Jason Krupp, and they say right now everything is really on the table as they look at solutions. They are thinking about this in a couple of ways, I think. On one hand, they want to continue the public health mission of Measure 110, and that is ensuring people with addictions are able to access services to treat those afflictions. But they're also very adamant that there's a public safety piece of this, that a more muscular response is necessary to try to stem this easy flow of drugs we are seeing. Here's what Lieber told me.
I think that we have to figure out how we go after the supply of drugs that are coming in. You know, we have to make it easier for us to shut down the open air drug markets that are happening not only in Portland, but in other parts of the state.
It is probably not a coincidence, Lauren, that not only are Lieber and Krupp lawmakers who are very engaged on these issues, but they are also both former prosecutors.
Interesting. Well, let's just mention here, too, something that's obvious to our extreme fan base. We talked about Measure 110 during the last podcast, and that's rare that we take on the same subject 2 podcasts in a row. But we decided to revisit it because, well, a lot of people, especially in Portland, are thinking and talking a lot about this issue right now and what the overdoses and open air drug markets have done to the city. But also, there was some significant news out of the state Supreme Court this week that's going to have an impact on a bill that lawmakers seem likely to consider, one that would make it easier to convict drug dealers. Before we get to that, though, tell us about this woman named Jocelyn Boyd.
So Jocelyn Boyd is a person who has had a very impactful role in how Oregon has enforced its drug laws. In 1986, she was living in Portland, and she was caught by police in possession of a large amount of heroin that was separated into 23 small baggies. Now, Boyd actually acknowledged to police that she intended to sell the drug. And so even though no one had seen her complete or even attempt to sell this heroin, prosecutors charged and convicted her of delivering a controlled substance, which is the state's crime for drug dealing, essentially. Boyd appealed that conviction, and she made the case that police had no proof she'd actually sold anything. But the Court of Appeals decided that didn't matter. It ruled that the fact that Boyd was caught with a significant amount of drugs that appeared intended for resale was enough to convict her of actually delivering the heroin. And like I said, this wound up being a very big deal because with this decision, prosecutors had a new tool on their belt that is now known as a Boyd delivery. And for 3 decades, it allowed them to charge people with drug dealing if they only found someone in possession of drugs deemed higher than a user amount. Actually, up until 2021, they did this a lot. An analysis that was commissioned by the Oregon Justice Resource Center suggested that around half of all drug delivery cases from 1990 to 2021 involved Boyd deliveries. So this was a very popular tool for prosecutors.
Okay, so that was the law of the land for 3 decades, but then in 2021, the Oregon Court of Appeals overturns that decision.
Yeah, that's right. 2 years ago, the Court of Appeals revisits the Boyd decision when it's taking up the case of a man named Brian G. Hubble. Washington County prosecutors had charged Hubble with drug delivery under very similar circumstances, actually, as Boyd. In Hubble's case, fentanyl was the drug in question, not heroin, but it was, separated into bags that appeared to be ready to be dealt. So prosecutors saw that and got him convicted of delivering a controlled substance. But Hubble appealed. And this time, the Court of Appeals looked at these set of facts pretty differently. They sort of reanalyzed the Boyd decision from 1988 and wound up feeling very strongly that it was sort of completely wrong. Actually, they called it not just wrong, but plainly wrong. And so they shut it down. They made Boyd deliveries, this thing that police and prosecutors had relied on for decades, suddenly illegal and not able to be used.
So that brings us up to this week when the appeals court opinion became law after it was upheld by the Oregon Supreme Court. And just to recap, it is now harder to convict people of dealing illicit drugs. What are prosecutors saying about this decision?
So basically, for the last 2 years since the Court of Appeals ruled, they've been saying the same thing, which is that it is now unreasonably difficult in Oregon for them to convict people most of the time for drug dealing. Under Hubble, this new decision, it's no longer good enough for police and prosecutors to find someone in possession of more than a user amount of drugs. They have to instead have proof that the person has actually dealt drugs or at least tried to deal drugs. And law enforcement types will tell you that that requires more resources than they can often bring to bear. I talked to a number of folks about the mechanics behind this. One was Andrew Freeman. He's a deputy district attorney in Washington County who does a lot of drug cases. And he says, since his office can no longer just charge dealers after, for instance, someone's caught with a lot of drugs in a traffic stop, Freeman says it gets a lot more complicated.
What you would be doing instead would be following that car to its ultimate destination, right? I mean, I'm just trying to play this out in my mind, right? Which may or may not be in the same county in which it's first spotted, right? And then the person goes inside or the car sits for X number of hours and you have to have a team that stays on it to wait and see when the change is, right, which could be the next day or a day later, right, and could happen inside a building or outside a building.
Obviously a lot of theoretical steps there. He's not talking about a specific case, but he's just sort of playing out this thought experiment of what it takes now to catch someone in the act of dealing drugs. I also talked to Marcia Harnden. She is the police chief in Albany, and she said because of this, it's now riskier in many instances to catch someone dealing drugs.
What that means to the drug team on the ground is that they have to go the extra step of either allowing the drugs to be delivered to an identified person under this ruling, or put a confidential informant or an undercover detective on the receiving end of those drugs. And your risks go way up.
And so that's how law enforcement sort of looks at this. And all this appears to have had some impact. It is not easy to figure out exactly what the Hubbell decision has meant for prosecutions writ large, because there are always a lot of variables in the criminal justice system. But just for instance, the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office says its referrals for the crime of delivering a controlled substance have plummeted by 75% in recent years. And it says at least a portion of that, it can't say exactly what, is because of this court decision.
So district attorneys, they can still prosecute people who are caught with large amount of drugs. It's not that these people cannot be convicted of crimes, just not the same crimes as law enforcement used to charge. So why aren't prosecutors okay with just pursuing the crimes they can prove under the Hubbell decision?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I wondered too. Oregon gets a lot of attention for decriminalizing drugs, but that only applies to pretty low amounts. There is still such a thing as a misdemeanor possession charge and a felony possession charge. And so even though prosecutors can't charge drug delivery as easily as they used to be, they can still charge attempted delivery or some of these higher possession charges. And what prosecutors will tell you about that is that from their perspective, they can't get serious enough consequences for those crimes. They say even felony possession can easily receive a small prison sentence or even probation, which, from their perspective is not serious enough to stop drug trafficking. And the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office notes also that we are in a public defense crisis, which is compounding this because some lower priority drug possession charges might not be enough to warrant a defendant, receiving a public defender, which in turn means that their charges actually can be dropped. Washington County DA Kevin Barton, who is a pretty well-known prosecutor as this sort of tough on crime type official, told me the system needs to be a hammer. And in his opinion, it is not a hammer right now, and that's just not helping Oregon address its issues.
And now prosecutors have the attention of some pretty influential lawmakers with these arguments, right?
Yeah, like you mentioned. I mean, the reason we started looking into this was that Senator Kate Lieber, one of the chairs of this new legislative committee on addiction, has been talking about the Hubbell decision as something that might warrant a change. And even Governor Kotek nodded to that possibility recently. What that looks like, I think, is yet to be seen. But just to underscore the change of approach we're seeing from lawmakers, Lauren, let's note that Republicans and prosecutors have been talking about changing the Hubbell decision for a long time. For the last 2 sessions, actually, Republicans have introduced bills that would let prosecutors continue charging people for delivery under this Boyd theory. Democrats had little interest in pursuing it, and I think that's partly because the Hubbell case was still in front of the Oregon Supreme Court, but also just because they were sort of in a different headspace, and that's changed now.
So that's what the prosecutors are saying about this. What about the defense attorneys? What do they have to say?
It will not surprise you. They oppose a return to prosecuting people under that Boyd decision for a number of reasons. The first is that they say it just doesn't make sense to convict people for a crime that prosecutors can't actually prove they committed. Here is Mallory Maloney. She's an attorney for the Oregon Justice Resource Center, which opposes Boyd convictions.
Certainly, it's easier to prosecute people for delivery when you're not actually having to prove that they have committed the offense of delivery. But I think that there's a fundamental unfairness to that.
And the other thing defense attorneys and opponents of this type of thing worry about is that reinstating Boyd deliveries will help Oregon return to a war on drugs mentality that had really negative outcomes for communities of color. There is some evidence that Boyd deliveries over time were used disproportionately on communities of color, though that's pretty hard to prove with the data we have. But they also say, this bill, if we bring back Boyd deliveries, could wind up sweeping up drug-addicted people who might be selling to support their habits. And they would argue that runs counter to Oregon's stated mission of helping drug users get treatment. So, they will certainly fight any bill to reinstate boy deliveries. It's just not clear to me right now whether the political winds are in their favor.
Well, here is perhaps the toughest question of the podcast. Is it possible to take a tougher approach to prosecuting these drug crimes while also keeping the spirit of Measure 110, which is moving people toward rehabilitation rather than criminalization at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I think plenty of people would argue that it is, right? Despite some of the rhetoric, Measure 110, as I noted, it didn't legalize dealing drugs or possessing large amounts of drugs. And so I think lawmakers are going to be walking this kind of fine line, trying to ensure that people struggling with addiction are able to access treatment in the ways that they need. That includes, detox and inpatient treatments, but also this cluster of services surrounding and apart from those things. But they're also making clear they want to get serious about cracking down on the things that are still against the law and causing problems. What that looks like is the big question to me. We know that legislators are definitely, probably, I think, going to take up a concept making it illegal to use drugs in public, which is something that has been a big issue in the city of Portland. City officials there are clamoring for it. There's a lot of momentum behind a concept like that, but it does raise concerns among some folks that pushing use into the shadow, where maybe it's harder to see, is going to make it harder to intervene in overdose. So there's a tricky conversation there. And there are plenty of other things that are going to be put forward. It feels almost certain to me lawmakers will discuss some way to ensure that people caught using drugs are interacting with the treatment system, which often doesn't happen right now. We don't know much about what any of that looks like. But, as we talked about last week, there's also action happening now, well ahead of session. Just this morning, actually, we learned about state troopers who are on bikes assisting Portland police with downtown patrols. So I don't know. It's hard to overstate just how much urgency and thought and hope is sort of going into this addiction issue right now.
Well, we will inevitably be talking about this effort more in the future, but let's just change topics briefly here to some different political news that went down this week. You covered an effort to recall one of Oregon's top Democratic lawmakers, and whoa, that went down in flames. What happened?
Yes, this was the effort to recall State Representative Paul Holvey of Eugene. Lauren, it failed spectacularly. I checked the latest tally before we sat down to record this, and the recall has, as of now, gone down by a margin of 90-10, which is just pretty much a result you do not see anywhere in politics these days. Voters who have elected Holvey reliably for almost 2 decades were just having no part of the arguments against him that were raised by UFCW Local 555. That's one of the state's largest unions that really made getting out of Holvey a very big priority this year, to its own chagrin at this point.
There have been a lot of recall efforts lately. This is one that actually made it to the ballot, but do you think that this spectacular fail will stop or at least slow down the desire to recall elected officials when they make a vote or a decision that people don't agree with? Basically, what I'm wondering is, will this failed effort have any long-term effects on future recall efforts?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine it won't. Like we sometimes talk about on this subject, recalls are actually pretty common or somewhat common when it comes to local officials, but actually forcing a recall election on a state official is practically unheard of in Oregon. This is only the 4th time in state history that has happened, and it had been 35 years since the last one. So, already very, very hard and rare. And then you take the fact that UFCW spent big on this effort. They spent more than $300,000 to get Holvey recalled, and they got absolutely nothing in return except for maybe the antipathy of Democrats who run the state. So I think right now this feels like a big cautionary tale for people who might be considering something like this. And also, as you hinted at, maybe an indication that if you want to unseat a popular lawmaker, you need proof that the person has committed a crime or some major ethical lapse, not just simply this argument that they've enacted policies that you don't like, because that is not going to get people moving in that direction.
All right, well, let's leave the conversation here today. Dirk, thanks for joining me on the podcast and for all of your hard work.
It is always a pleasure to talk to you, Lauren.
This week's episode was produced by Andrew Thien. Our audio engineer is Stephen Cray, and our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thanks for your support, and thank you for listening.